Hey, welcome everybody. If you're joining us today, our host Tim Krueger is going to be kicking things off here in just a moment with the listings. You're getting offers. We're going to be talking about how to review for offers, prepping for closing. Certainly, those of you that are in on the Zoom right now, feel free to unmute and ask questions at will. If you're joining us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube or wherever, feel free to make comments. Typing wise, we can put them up on the screen and we can answer them live, or even afterwards. If you're watching the recording of this later, feel free to ask questions. We will certainly get back to you right away with any answers or feedback. And thanks so much, Tim, for being here as always. And take it away. Appreciate you.
All right, thanks, Dan. Yes, listings today, not really about listing appointments or entering listings or marketing listings. This is really starting at the point of you receive an offer. You're the listing agent, you receive an offer. What do we do? So we will cover kind of a high-level overview. What do you do when you get an offer? What forms are we going to deal with? The counter offer and the multiple counter proposal. We'll dive into those a bit. What do you do after an offer is accepted in those first few days? What do you do the couple of weeks before closing, prepping for closing, and then after, what do you do? So lots of different topics. There's nothing really novel or earth-shattering here. I'm going to review several of the ways that I do it. It's one way to do it. If you're a brand new agent, this would be a good guide of a way to start. If you're an existing agent, you've done deals already, you already know how to do all this stuff. So hopefully you take away 1 or 2 or 5 ideas that you can incorporate into the system that you already have, or maybe something to look out for example, with the multiple counter proposal. So I'm hoping there will be a few nuggets in today's class for everyone. Okay, you received an offer, now what? Well, first thing I do is check the accept by date. Did they give you until midnight tomorrow, or did they give you until 3 p.m. this afternoon? That makes a huge difference in how you respond. Of course, if it's not a very good offer, that date doesn't matter so much. But if it's one that the seller may want to accept, you want to make sure you jump on that so the seller has the chance to make that decision. Let the seller know right away that an offer has been received. At least give some basic details right away as soon as you can. That's our duty, to pass these on and present these offers as soon as possible. That word present, that can mean a lot of things. It certainly, meeting with the seller, reviewing the entire offer in detail, absolutely, that counts. I would say presenting it counts if you email it or just text about it and say, hey, we received it, here's the price, here's a few other high-level details. Do as much as you can right away, just so they know it's been received, they can start thinking about it. Let the seller know and be aware of yourself that any offer can be withdrawn at any time before, not only before acceptance, but before acceptance and delivery. So don't say things like, okay, seller, we have until midnight tomorrow to accept this. Well, you do, unless they withdraw it. So make sure you make that distinction, because if it's a really good offer, if you don't bring that up, the seller's not going to know necessarily that they could withdraw the offer. So let them know, if you're pretty sure you want to accept this one, let's not wait. Now, if they're waiting for other offers, well, that's a decision to make, but make sure they know it can be withdrawn. Confirm with the agent that submitted the offer. Let them know you received it. It's just professional courtesy to let them know. If we're on the buyer side, we certainly want to know that it's been received. Notify other agents that you've received an offer. Other agents that have written an offer, that have expressed interest, that have said they might be writing. You can do this through showing time. You can do this through email, text, phone call, however you want to do it. But to serve your seller the best, let everybody else know as soon as possible that an offer has been received, because if that prompts another buyer or another agent that may prompt them to write an offer sooner. So definitely do that right away. and review the offer. That's coming up next. So now Dan's he's gonna yell at me for this. You don't have to do this. I don't always do this, but this just kind of highlights. Make sure you go over these offers in detail. So here's a great way to do it. Print it out, get out your highlighter and red pen. Sometimes I don't always do this. Sometimes I just go through the offer and make notes and I don't print anything out, but it's more of a visual. If you print it out, anything that's been filled in, any pertinent term, even some boilerplate language that hasn't been modified, such as the condo doc review contingency. Well, it's boilerplate, but it's a contingency in the offer. It's an important piece of the offer that I need to review with the seller. It's an important term. So I highlight anything that's important. If something's really important, maybe I highlight it in a different color, or if something maybe is, maybe I think, well, we need to fix this. Maybe this is wrong. We should counter this, or at some point this needs to be shored up. Sometimes I get out 2 colors of highlighters. Sometimes I just make notes in the margin. Sometimes I'm in a document or an email, just kind of typing up notes. Create an offer summary. Now, this can be as simple as go through the offer and just jot down the few simple terms that are in the offer. Sometimes this can be 5, 6, 7 lines long to give an accurate description or summary of the offer. Usually I make 2 lists. One is the terms of the offer, and then I kind of make another list of, well, here's some comments or maybe some points that we need to consider countering. Because if you just review the offer and you have these thoughts, if you don't write them down, they're going to go away. And then you remember thinking it, but the seller never thought it because you never shared it with them. So I like to document things, again, whether that's typing them up, writing them down, or highlighting. This is my big scary warning. The seller will not read the offer in detail. You've hopefully read the offers. You've certainly dealt with offers. There's things that you know about offers that are just common sense to you. And that is not the case with sellers. They don't know what you know, and they are not going to read the offer in detail. So assume they know nothing, and anything that they need to know about the offer, whether it's something written in, whether it's a boilerplate part of the offer, it's just the way every offer works. They don't know how every offer works. So make sure you point those things out to them. They're going to rely on your list, your summary. They're going to look at what you consider important enough to put on your summary list, or however you present that to them, whatever you bring up in the conversation that you have, the negatives that you bring up. If you don't bring something up as a negative, they're not going to assume it's a negative. Very important. Take the time to double and triple check during this phase, certainly as you're reviewing the offer, but also take the time to review it with the seller. And sometimes if you have multiple offers, you're not going to spend an extreme amount of time on every offer. If you can spend enough time on the offer to, maybe it's just purchase price, and that rules it out right out of the gate. Well, if this, certainly you still present it to the seller. Once they say no, you move on to the next one. But once you narrow it down to one that's going to be accepted, make sure you spend some time and go through that offer with a fine-tooth comb. Play devil's advocate. Look for the loopholes. How could things go wrong if everything lines up just the wrong way? What could go wrong? Because it doesn't always go wrong, but sometimes it does. And you want to protect yourself from that, but more importantly, protect your seller from something going wrong. So if you see a loophole, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but now's the time to bring it up and mention that to the seller that this could happen. Do you want to shore it up, or are you good with that? Make sure all the proper forms are included and signed. This is the ideal time to gather up everything and make sure it's included. A lot of times, if you notice, for example, they forget to do addendum S, the lead-based paint addendum, the buyer agent will probably scramble and get that done and get that submitted. So now's the time to make sure all that happens. Be very careful with another company's addendum A or anything that's written in, because this, really anything outside of those WB forms, although the WRA forms, the ones that they create, you can rely on those as well. But anything else, you just don't know. And we have to be very careful about reviewing these, because these are not standard documents, even though different brokerages addendum A's are pretty standard. It's a big mistake. For example, even if something is pre-checked on another company's addendum A, and maybe it's disclosure type language, and you just kind of breeze over it saying, oh, yep, I recognize that. That's one of those standard disclosure languages. Don't ever do that. You need to read every one of those, because if it's checked, whether it's specifically checked, whether it's pre-checked, that becomes a part of the offer. And you don't know what it says unless you read it. You can assume what it says, but just be very careful and read it. Make sure you understand it. Look for the loopholes and understand them. Be very careful, especially with escalation clauses. It's not necessarily that escalation clauses are wrong. Well, some may be ambiguous, but they don't all work the same. So be very careful that you understand how that one works. And if you don't understand it, or if you see a couple different ways it could be interpreted, shore that up. Verbal, having a conversation with the buyer's agent to understand how they view it as working. Well, that's better than nothing, but what matters is what's in writing. So it's best to put that in writing if it needs some shoring up. Look at what's included. This, a lot of times we'll have discussions when we first meet a seller at their house. We'll have a discussion when we're listing the property. Oh yeah, I want to take that. I don't want to take that. I want to leave that. Now's the time that matters. It doesn't matter what we put in the listing contract. It doesn't matter what we put in the MLS. What matters is what ends up in the offer. So now's the time to not only double check that with your notes, what's in the MLS, did they ask for everything that's been offered, or is anything excluded? Make sure the seller knows that now's the time to double check, and they need to be good with everything. Things like sheds in the backyard. Well, most of the time sellers don't want to take them, but if it's not on a permanent foundation and it's not listed as included, the seller should be taking it. Now, is that the intent of the buyer or the buyer agent? Does the buyer want the shed? If they don't want a shed that's not on a permanent foundation, they simply don't have to list it. It's considered personal property. The seller should move it prior to closing. So again, not a big deal if you have this conversation now. Maybe the buyer actually wants it. Maybe the seller doesn't care. They're good with moving it, but you don't want the final walkthrough to come and get that phone call of, hey, you got to get that shed out of here. And you and the seller had no idea. So just look at what's included and excluded very carefully. Things like audio system. How is it worded? Are the components included? Are they not? What does the seller want to do? Home security. What pieces of the home security? Cameras, Ring doorbells, things like that. I harped on that a little bit, but this is an easy one to come back and bite you a couple days before closing. And this is the best spot to head that off. Okay, more. Any gray areas that need to be shored up? Well, sheds we talked about, satellite dish. Satellite dishes on the roof, if they're not mentioned, they stay. It's considered a fixture. TV, mounting brackets are included by the wall-mounted ones. Mounting brackets are included by default. TVs are not. Garbage bins. Well, these are pretty straightforward, right? Usually they're not the seller's property. They're there. They stay with the house. They should stay with the house. If there's a service, pelletary or waste management through, you pay it on your taxes, you pay it through the city, you have that service, those should be left. Well, do you want to add that in just to make sure the seller leaves them? Also, sometimes you don't have those bins and the seller has their own bins and they're going to take them. Again, these aren't usually deal breakers, but now's the time to have those conversations. Are the details correct? A lot of times I think it's line two. Is the agent an agent of buyer, an agent of seller, or an agent of both? A lot of times I see no strikeouts through there. So on the review side, look at that. And that's something that should be shored up if it's missing or if it's wrong. Check email addresses. Check your email, check their email, because if their email is wrong, you can't actually deliver anything. Or if you delivered it to the address in that they wrote, if it's wrong, they would never get it. So just double check. Typos, especially right there, matter a lot. Again, no one probably cares until somebody's looking for an out of the offer, and then they pinpoint that, oh, well, there was a typo in the email address, so we never actually had binding acceptance. You don't want to give an easy out if eventually someone might be looking for that. Make sure you have signatures in all the right spots. Check the dates. Make sure the date it was written isn't next week or something. Make sure the closing date isn't in the past. City, village, town, just make sure that's correct. Price, closing date, double check that, triple check that, make sure those are correct. Okay, dates. This is kind of a big one, and I think often overlooked. Is there enough time for seller to perform all requirements? Typically, because generally all the seller has to do is get title work ordered, which we take care of. So we need to make sure there's enough time to get title work, and seller needs enough time to move out. So this is a good time to have a conversation with them of their move out plans. Time frames for contingencies. When do they start? Well, typically they start at acceptance, but has anything been modified? Could something possibly start before acceptance? Are things such as the well and septic inspections, are they 15 days before closing? Are they 15 days after acceptance? Or if there's a home sale contingency, do contingencies not start until there's an accepted offer? Just understand that. Is the closing date okay with the seller? Not only time frame, but that particular day. Are they going to be out of town? Not that a closing can't happen with a seller out of town, but it's easier if they're in town just to coordinate the move as well. This is a big one that I think often gets overlooked. What if the deadline for the finance contingency is the 29th of next month and the closing date is the 30th of next month? Well, that's fine. That can still close, but this is the time to let the seller know that, by the way, this means that you'll have to coordinate your closing and pretty much be moved out before we have a financing commitment letter. So you could be all moved out, and then the buyer says, oops, sorry, can't get my financing. Here's a letter of denial. I guess we have to terminate the offer. Give me my earnest money back. And the buyer would have full rights to do that. Now, I don't think that conversation happens very often. It not at this point. A lot of times it might happen when the seller calls the moving company and they have to put some money down. They have to commit to moving, or they're actually moving out and they say, hey, are we good to go? And then you say, well, we don't have financing yet. And a seller, it's fair for them to know before they accept that that's the time frame and that could happen. Most sellers, I think, are going to be fine with that. But if they're not, now's the time to let them know when they can still do something about it. Okay. Some pet peeves. Not even pet peeves, just some maybe oddities or nuances. Odd tax prorations. Now, really, current assessment times current mill rate, that's pretty typical. Last year's or current year's taxes, if known, that's fine. I believe that's the default in the offer. I generally go with current times current. It depends. One is, in certain situations, one is better for the seller, one is better for the buyer. Usually those are pretty close. Problem is the assessment can go up. Well, they do go up much earlier than the new mill rate is known. So an assessment could go up 20%. Let's say an entire municipality their assessments get increased 10% or 20%. Well, that doesn't mean the taxes are going to go up 10% or 20%, because the budget may go up a little bit, but if the assessments went up more, the mill rate's going to go down, but the mill rate's not known until later in the year. So is that better for the buyer? Is that better for the seller? None of those are necessarily wrong or deal breakers, and sometimes they don't make a big deal, but sometimes you have to think about that and figure out what's better and how much of a difference it might make. So just be cognizant of that, have those conversations with the seller. There's that reproration option. That's wonderful for new construction. There are some other instances where it could come into play, but for typical transactions, we're not using this. Buyers and sellers, they want to close and be done, not have a lingering obligation that goes for months or close to a year after closing. But there are times that should be used. Sometimes full surveys are requested of land or property, even sometimes in a platted neighborhood or a certified survey map. This makes more sense if you're buying 30 acres out in the country to know where your boundaries are. But if that's what a buyer wants, if a buyer wants a full survey or a licensed surveyor to come out and flag the corners, even of a residential lot in a platted neighborhood, well, if that's what they want, that's fine. But a lot of times what the buyer wants is just, hey, could the seller just go out and flag the corners? We know it's not binding or won't be perfect, but we just want to have an idea where the corners are. Can the seller go do that? Well, if that's all they want, but they're asking for, in the offer, a licensed surveyor to create a map and flag the corner, just know what's being asked for. Addendum B, the well system. Well, I remember in the old Addendum B, there used to be a spot under septic system where you could check the box for something about vertical separation to confirm there's so much. Well, that requires drilling and stuff. And I remember that used to get checked and no one ever did it. Same thing here, kind of with well capacity, water yield. That's a different box you can check that says basically, hey, when the inspector comes out to inspect the well system, have them record well capacity and water yield. Honestly, this may get done every time, but I've never noted it. I've never read it on a report. I don't recall if it just happens by default or if it never happens, but I've never had this come up where a buyer or another agent says, hey, we checked that and we need that. So I don't know what your experience has been, but if that's important to a buyer, then it's fine to have in there. Generally, it's not important. Okay, seller's options. And I kind of dumb it down a little bit and I try to make it funny when I say, okay, seller, here's your options, and it might be a wonderful offer, 50,000 over list price and cash and close in 3 weeks. And the seller loves it. I'll still say, okay, seller, you have some options. You can accept this. You can reject it outright, and then they giggle. Well, why would I do that? Well, you wouldn't. I just want you to know what your options are. You can accept, reject, counter, multiple counter if there's more than one, or do nothing. So I some of these can quickly be ruled out. If they accept, sign, initial, all the correct spots, and deliver all the pages of the offer, not just the signature pages, deliver all the pages of the offer back to the other agent. I know we don't always get those back. Not everybody follows this rule, but at least we want to be following that rule. And I think that's an important one. So always send everything back. This next bullet, in some cases, acceptance may be followed by an amendment to shore up relatively minor details, but be careful. For example, there's one little typo in an offer, and maybe it's that line 2 on the first page of the offer. Hey, you forgot to cross out to indicate that you're an agent of the buyer. And the seller doesn't want to counter. The buyer doesn't want to submit a new offer. Maybe you talk with the buyer agent and say, hey, if we accept this, by the way, we still need to shore this up. We can just do an amendment after acceptance. Sure, that's fine. The buyer agent would want to do that. You'd want to do that. it wouldn't necessarily hurt the seller if that were just accepted. So that's an easy one to say, yeah, we can accept this. We'll do an amendment after the fact. Sometimes, and I don't know if you've done it, I've done it, where, hey, we could change this. I'd rather have you send me a new offer or a counter offer to your own offer, Mr. Buyer agent, or even an amendment. An amendment can be submitted by a buyer prior to acceptance. And this is actually a great way to do it, but it only works when you know the date that the offer is going to be accepted, if it's going to be accepted. For example, today, let's say I wrote an offer today and for a listing, and the deadline to accept is midnight tonight. So I know that if this gets accepted, it has to be today. So I can draft up an amendment that references an acceptance date of today, and I can change anything, the purchase price or the terms of the offer. And now the seller has the option, if they can accept the offer, and then they can also choose to accept the amendment, and they send it all back at the same time. So that is a way to do it with an amendment before acceptance. You can also shore things up after acceptance. Just be careful, because no one has to agree to it after acceptance. Okay, if you reject, it's more professional to formally reject it, have the seller initial the last page of the offer and deliver it back to the agent. That's ideal. Short of that, at least communicate. Don't just let the time run out and not get back to the other person. We don't like to be treated like that, so let's not treat the other agents like that. They took the time to write the offer, even if it was a bad one. Even if you don't get the seller's initials, at least have good communication. Countering. Okay, if seller's countering, the seller should be initialing the offer, the last page, to indicate that they're countering, and they should sign and initial all addendums. So all of that stuff is taken care of. Add your presented by info. And when countering, just like when accepting, deliver all the offer docs, not just the signature pages. As far as numbering, it should be counter 1 by seller, counter 2 by buyer. It's not counter 1 by seller and then counter 1 by buyer. But it could be, let's see, the second one there, counter 1 by buyer, counter 2 by seller, counter 3 by seller. Sure, you can do it that way too. Keep in mind and make sure the seller knows that delivering a counter offer is a formal rejection of the original offer. I think we all know that, but sellers don't know that. So make sure they know that, hey, once we counter, that original offer is dead. If they say no to this counter offer, you can't go back and say, oh, okay, wait, I was just kidding, I'll just accept the first one. You don't have that option anymore. And there's no guarantee that the buyer would put that offer back in place. So make sure that they understand when they counter, the first offer is dead. Okay, counter offer. Okay, you should be able to see Sky Slope and a counter offer on the screen. If you can't, somebody holler at me. Okay. I swear I did that, but here's a mess up already. Okay, counter offer by seller. Okay. Counter 1 by seller. So there's a couple of notes. All these notes in the counter offer and the multiple counter are pretty important. Basic stuff for us, but again, stuff that we should let the seller know. The top one is just what we just talked about, how to number this sequentially. And here's where it says, we reference the date of the offer, the address, the buyers. That offer is rejected. And I like to point this out to a seller, this is where we're formally rejecting that. And now this new offer that we're making is referencing that offer. It includes all the terms of that offer with the following changes. Now, when we get to counter offer 2, 3, 4, nothing in those interim or earlier counter offers count. It's only the offer plus the changes in the current counteroffer unless something specific from another counteroffer is referenced. So for example, down here in the body of the counteroffer, if you say, lines 12 to 17 of counteroffer number 2 by buyer are hereby incorporated into this counteroffer. Yes, you can do that, but oh boy, that gets messy. It's cleaner just to keep it offer plus current counteroffer. But no, it is an option to incorporate other terms from other counters if you reference them. It's just not a good practice. Okay. In the body, I just want to point out a few things of to do, not to do. Purchase price is 250,000, and yep, that's fine. So we're changing the purchase price here. The deadline for the inspection contingency shall be 10 days after acceptance. Maybe it was 15 days or 20 days, and we just wanted to shorten that up. That's an acceptable way to say that because you're referencing the contingency sufficiently and you're referencing the time frame. Now, here's another way to do it. Line 206 of the WB11 residential offer to purchase shall be, this contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless buyer within 10 days of acceptance delivers. Well, that sounds kind of weird, but let's take a look. Line 206, that's the line where we specify how the deadline. So, you can reference that blank, you can reference the inspection contingency, but if you're going to reference a line, don't just say line 206, 10 days. Well, what does that mean? 10 days replaces the whole line, 10 days goes into the blank. Make sure in plain English, it just makes sense. So when I say line 206 shall read, I mean from start to finish, I just replaced the whole thing. And I ended it with delivers, because then it goes on to the next line. I know this is pretty basic for some of you, but I at least want to get to some things to watch out for. For example, line 206 on page 4 of the offer shall read. Now, can you just say offer instead of WB11 residential offer to purchase? Well, the WB11 residential offer to purchase is the name of that document. Offer is not. But I don't know what other way offer could be interpreted. So I think it's fine to say just offer. And I go either way. Sometimes if I need to save space, I'll just go offer. If I'm feeling extra thorough, I'll say WB11 residential offer to purchase. Here's what I don't like. This is fine because it says line 206 on page 4. But here I'm adding in extra detail that's not necessary. And what if I goof up and I say line 206 on page 5? Could that create problems in the offer? I mean, it's pretty obvious what you meant. You referenced a line number, but there is no line number on page 5. So don't put extra information in because it brings up extra opportunities to make a mistake. This next one is not as good. If you were to say line 206 to read, ... within 10 days of acceptance, ... I've used this one before, but what I mean by it is everything leading up to the part where it says within so many days of acceptance, leave everything before that, leave everything after that, but this part changes to that. That's what I meant, but that's not necessarily what I said. If I were just to say line 206 to read and I completely remove line 206 and add this in with the dots, that offer is not going to make any sense. So I don't really like that. It would probably be fine, but it's not recommended. Okay, what I really don't like is don't take this much of a shortcut. In a counteroffer, don't say line 206, 10 days. Well, line 206 of what? And 10 days where? We kind of all know what that means, but it's not specific enough. Also, for example, finance contingency. Don't just say finance contingency 7%. 7% what? What is 7%? So it has to be a little more specific. If you need more space than this, just create a blank addendum, call it addendum Z or addendum, whatever you want to call it, and just add it in here. And then you've got as much space as you need. There's this little note, any warranties, covenants, and representations made in this counteroffer survive the closing of this transaction. So yeah, if there's statements made, just because you get to closing doesn't mean a seller or a buyer can say, okay, great, I got away with that lie. Well, no, they're still liable for being held to this contract. However, after closing, for the most part, we are out of it. After closing, if this contract needed to be enforced by the parties, they would want to contact, or you would want them to contact their attorneys for that. Here it states, the party making this counteroffer may withdraw the counteroffer, not only before acceptance, but before, it could be after acceptance, but before delivery. So it's really before binding acceptance, before delivery occurs, it can be withdrawn. Let the seller know that too, that, hey, we could counter this back, give the buyer until tomorrow night. If we get a better offer in the meantime, we can always withdraw this up until the point that they sign it and send it back to us. Down here is where provisions from okay, I mentioned that up here. This counteroffer does not include the terms or conditions in any other counteroffer or multiple counter proposal. Okay, so that's an extension of this. Provisions from a previous counteroffer may be included either by restating them or by referencing them. Okay. Holler if anybody has stories, crazy things they've had happen with a counteroffer or a multiple counter. I'll just keep going, but if somebody's got a good one, we've got time to share. Okay, moving on to multiple offers. If you get more than one offer, the seller has more options. They can pick one offer and accept it and reject all the others. You could, as the listing agent, you probably should ask all agents to submit their clients' highest and best offers by a certain date and time. Seller could reject all the offers. I'm sure that's happened at some point. Seller can say, ignore all offers except for one. They could pick one that stands out and they could counter back just that one. They could send a multiple counter proposal, and that's a big difference. There is no multiple counter offer. The form is a multiple counter proposal. We'll dive into that in a little bit, but that word kind of makes all the difference. Not necessarily the word, but it just distinguishes it between a counter offer. So send a multiple counter to all buyers, and keep in mind that the terms do not have to be the same in all the multiple counter proposals. And they typically aren't, because the offers aren't the same. So you shore up different offers in different ways, but geez, they don't even have to be the same price. Or if more than two offers are received, a seller could send a multiple counter to less than all the buyers. So if you get 20 offers, a lot of times the seller will say, all right, let's pick the best 5 or the best 2 or 3, and let's work with them more in depth. That's an option too. Multiple counter proposal is not a counter offer. It's a multiple counter proposal. That's the name on the form. It's not a offer. It's not a multiple counter offer or a counter offer, because it cannot be accepted by the buyer. So there's nothing that the buyer can do when they receive a multiple counter proposal to lock up that deal. The terminology is multiple. The seller can send a multiple counter proposal, and then the ball goes into the buyer's court, and the buyer, they can't accept it, but they can approve it. And then once they approve it, it goes back to the seller, and then the seller has the option to accept that. So I think of it this way, and these are some of the phrases I use to explain this to buyers and sellers. The multiple counter proposal from a seller is really just a suggestion to a buyer of what terms that that buyer should counter back to the seller with. Because a buyer that would approve a multiple counter proposal that was sent to them it would be the exact same thing if they took those terms, put it on a new counteroffer, and sent it back to the seller. That's essentially what it is. It'd be the same as the seller filling out a counteroffer for the buyer, not signing anything, and say, here, buyer, why don't you counter back with this? I'm not saying I'm going to accept it, but this increases your chances, right? It's kind of the same thing. So when a buyer receives a multiple counter, they have two options or three options. They could reject it or do nothing. They can sign the multiple counter to approve it, or they could send a new counter offer back, either with the same terms or better terms or worse terms. Okay. Oh, this is what we just talked about. Okay. To counter or multiple counter. This is a great conversation to have with the seller. The multiple counter proposal form is not always the best option. It's definitely a powerful tool to have in your toolbox. It often is the best option, but not always. With the multiple counter proposal, with there being no option for a buyer to sign it, if you've been on the buyer side and you get a multiple counter proposal, it sucks. And it can be very demotivating or annoying to someone who's otherwise a great buyer. And they could say, the heck with this, I'm not playing these games. So another option, let's say you've got an offer from somebody who the price isn't the highest, but it's a cash deal. They've given proof of funds. They're actually a solid cash buyer with money in the bank, and they want to close in 3 weeks and no other contingencies, big earnest money. Everything but the price looks wonderful. You couldn't imagine, if you could just get that price up, you couldn't imagine having a better offer. Well, you could pick several offers and multiple counter them. And with this particular buyer, the only thing that changes might be the price. And if you're thinking, hey, if they accept that, there's no way I would not accept, that one if they approve the multiple counter. Well, in that situation, it's probably best just to send a single counter offer back to that one buyer, because a buyer is more likely to accept a counter offer than approve a multiple counter, because the buyer knows that if I sign this, we're done. I got the house. That's a little more motivating than a multiple counter proposal. But if a seller says, boy, I don't care if they're cash or financing, if I can get another 5,000 or 10,000 out of a different buyer, I price means everything. I don't care about the terms. Maybe multiple counter proposal is best. So there's never one right answer in all situations. Multiple counter proposal. I shouldn't use multiple offer. Okay, not the proposal, just you get multiple offers. Some do's and don'ts. Communicate. This is, a lot of people, and we do as well. If we're on the buy side and we submit an offer and crickets, we can't get the listing agent on the phone. We can't get any confirmation that they've received our offer. It's just frustrating. So on the list side, don't be that listing agent that frustrates other buyers, because we work with everybody in the future. So communicate well. Don't disclose any details of another offer to another agent. This is hard to do, or hard not to do sometimes. So you have to really be cognizant about it. Sometimes what seem like innocent conversations go too far and they cross that line. Have a thorough discussion with the seller about all of their options and the different possible outcomes, even the ones that they're obviously not gonna choose. At least put it out there so they can choose not to do it. Don't make statements you're not 100% sure of. For example, don't tell all the buyers that have written an offer, or buyers who have not written an offer, seller's going to review offers at 6 p.m. tonight. Well, and then they accept one at 2 p.m. So be very careful when you're making statements like that it's, I don't want to say true, because it may have been true at the time. Make sure it's not only true, but it's not going to change. I think it's okay it's definitely okay. And in fact, you should be doing this. Recommend to agents how their offers could be better. Don't insinuate that if you do this, it'll be accepted, unless that's the case. or that is better than another offer. Because even if it's better than another offer now, you don't know if another offer is going to make their offer better. So be careful with it. It's easy to cross that line, but telling someone, boy, your earnest money is low, I'd like to see that a little bit higher, or your purchase price, we'd like to see that higher purchase price would improve your offer. Well, of course it would. That doesn't necessarily, they could already be the highest purchase price. So telling them how they can improve their offer isn't the same thing as telling them the details of another offer. Proceed with caution. I like this. The situation is stressful for buyers agents, buyers, as well as the listing agent, but sellers love it. Fair enough. Okay, multiple counter proposal. This one goes a little quicker, but there's just so many little nuggets in it. Okay, you should see the multiple counter proposal. And boy, I highlighted just about everything in here. But if you've never read through this form, it's all laid out. A multiple counter proposal is being made by seller to one or more other prospective buyers. So can you use this form if you've only received one offer? The quick answer is no, because it says you're stating that not only have you received multiple offers, you're making an offer out to multiple other, or at least one other prospective buyer. Okay. So now I'm not going to get into this deep, but if you ever get to the point where, hey, I'd love to use that multiple counter proposal form where I can send some terms back to a buyer to see if they would send those back to me. And then I, as the seller, or my seller, gets to choose if they actually want to accept that or not. So could we use this form? Because I like a lot of pieces of this form. And the answer is, well, maybe, but you certainly have to cross out that line that says you're sending this to multiple buyers. So my suggestion would be, though, if you want to use something like this, where you essentially send a counter offer back to a buyer and they send it back, but they can't accept it, and then you as the seller have the option, there's a better way to do it. If that's the case, why not just say, from the listing agent's point of view or seller's point of view, hey, buyer's agent, these are the terms that are more likely to get accepted. If you send a counter offer with these terms, seller may be more likely to accept it. Because that's really what you're saying with the multiple counter proposal. Here's some terms that if you approve these and send them back, the seller may accept, they may not. So anyways, I wanted to put that out there. That question has come up once and it was intriguing. And I believe it's possible, but I don't think there's other ways to do it. So, okay, the terms of this multiple counter proposal may differ from the terms of other multiple counter proposals. Yep, that makes sense. This multiple counter proposal is not binding on seller or buyer until seller's binding acceptance. Not buyer's approval, seller's binding acceptance. Seller or buyer, either one, may withdraw their multiple counter proposal or accepted. So seller or buyer may withdraw their multiple counter proposal or accepted multiple counter proposal anytime prior to binding acceptance. The accepted multiple counter, that threw me there for a moment, but if it's accepted and it takes you an hour to email it back, it can still be withdrawn during that time. So until the seller accepts, it's not a done, until the seller accepts and delivers back, it's not a done deal. Okay, the middle here. This is where we said the seller is saying, okay, the seller is saying, buyer, this multiple counter proposal will expire and be null and void unless you approve this. Sign here to approve it, not accept it, and send it back by this deadline. Once it gets sent back, well, let me back up. That's where the seller is giving the deadline. The next section is where the buyer approves it. And essentially the language in here says, okay, seller, well, I'm going to approve this, but now you need to accept it and you have a deadline. The note here, if the above multiple counter proposal by seller is not approved in buyer in its entirety, so it's either all approved or not, you can't make changes on this form. If you want to counter back something different, either better or worse, don't use this form for a counter offer. Instead, use the regular counter offer and submit it back. Okay, once the buyer approves and sends it back, this is where the seller signs and sends it back. And a note, seller should not sign below if there is an existing accepted offer unless this multiple counter proposal provides that it would be in a secondary offer. So we all know that, but boy, some of those things are easy to forget when we get into the trenches here and all these offers and crazy things happening. So any questions on that? I don't know if I muddied it up or helped make it make sense, but these can be fun, but oh boy, there's a lot of ways to mess these up. Okay, keep going on. Should be back to the presentation. A few more slides on just what to do after acceptance. Okay, review everything for accuracy. Hopefully you've already done this before acceptance, so you know if anything needed to be fixed. Make sure you got all signatures, initials, dates are not only correct, but not blank. Delivery, did delivery happen in time? Make sure all the necessary documents are executed. The condition reports, the condo addendum, the condition report, addendum B, addendum S, all of that. Send a complete copy of the offer. I like to kind of organize it and put it all into one email with just that one offer. Here's the accepted offer. Keep these for your records. Update the MLS listing status, however you normally do that, whether you can do that yourself or you have Fdesk do that for you or you have an admin do that. Make sure that MLS listing status gets updated. If your offer no-show, which is still pending, technically it's called pending in Paragon, but the label is offer no-show, means no open houses, no showing. So cancel any future open houses or showings if it's offer no-show. Send an offer summary or a closing timeline. However you do that, send something to the seller so they know what they accepted and what to expect and the deadlines to watch, and do they have anything to do. Make sure they know what they have to do. Make sure they know what the buyer has to do and what we're expecting. Upload the offer docs to SkySlope. Get that stuff in there right away so they can be approved. So with another set of eyes on it, if something is missing, you've got plenty of time before closing to shore that up. Okay, more after acceptance. Everybody does this a little different. Enter all your tasks and deadlines into your system, whether that be a CRM, Evernote, your calendar, a spreadsheet, a piece of paper. Somewhere you need to organize all these deadlines that you either need to watch or perform by. First few things to look out for: make sure that earnest money gets submitted. Pre-approval letter or proof of funds, that comes up right away. Make sure the inspection gets scheduled, although if the buyer's not scheduling the inspection, you don't necessarily need to nudge them along. If they're wasting their time and not getting it done, that's on them, but keep an eye on that. Appraisal scheduling, this is something you do want to see. If they need financing, you want to make sure that appraisal is getting scheduled because that's something that has to happen. And then order title work. Don't wait too long to do this. Before you order it, check with the seller to see if they have previous title work. Ideally, you've done this in the pre-listing phase, so they had time to go look for it. So now you already have that. When you order the title work, you need to provide that previous title work at the time you order it, typically. So you don't want to have to wait a few days to order it. This allows you to get that title work ordered right away and still get that discount. Okay, 2 weeks out from closing. Well, schedule closing. Actually, 2 weeks is too late for this. Schedule closing as soon as you can. Because you have to coordinate with buyer, seller, listing agent, buyer agent, closing officer schedule. There's a lot of parties that as soon as you can, get that closing schedule. Obtain the title work, deliver it to buyer. Oftentimes the title company will send it to the buyer's agent automatically, but make sure that they're CC'd on it. Make sure that got delivered to them. Review the title work. If you're on the seller side, it's As long as the buyer's good with it, it's fine. But you may want to take a look at it just to see, oh boy, I know that this is going to cause a problem right before closing, so let's deal with it now. So it's always good to review it just to see if anything jumps out at you. About 1 week prior to closing, reach out to the closing officer to make sure they have everything they need. Have they been trying to get a hold of the lender and they're not communicating with them? Or, a lot of times they'll say, yep, we're all good. I got everything I need, or we've been talking. Wonderful. I kind of feel like our job as agents is kind of the quarterback. Well, maybe the coach, I guess. There's a lot that we don't do, but I think our job is to make sure everybody else is doing their job. Buyers, sellers, other agents, lenders, closing officers, inspectors, everybody. Okay, prepping for closing. Let sellers know some of the basics, because again, they don't do this every month, every year. Let sellers know that they need to bring their driver's licenses to closing. Check on the seller's moving plans. Coordinate the final walkthrough. When are they going to be moved out? Get a copy of the prelim closing statement and review that. Get a copy of the final closing statement. Sometimes you can review the preliminary with the seller. Sometimes it doesn't make sense because there's not enough detail in there yet, but certainly the final closing statement. I think it's a nice touch to review that with the seller ahead of time, or at least send it to them and give them a brief explanation, and at least say, hey, if you want to talk about this ahead of time, great, let's chat. Otherwise, they'll review this in detail at closing. Some sellers want to understand every last penny before they get to closing. Some sellers will just say, I don't care. It is what it is. And waiting until closing is fine. But you should review it. Make sure everything that's in the offer, including amendments. A lot of times amendments for closing cost credits or things like that, or price reductions, but there's different things that happen after acceptance of the offer with amendments. A lot of times those amendments don't make it to the lender or don't make it to the closing officer. So they can't put it in the closing statement if they don't know about it, but you know about it. So this is the chance really at the prelim stage to say, oh yeah, this is the correct commission. We changed the purchase price. There's a closing cost credit. This is a spot where you should be actively working with the closing officer to make sure this is right. Make sure the home warranty gets ordered if that's a part of the transaction. At some point, pick up your marketing materials from the property. Pick up the lockbox. A lot of times, if the buyer agent is going to do a walkthrough, they'll need the lockbox there. A lot of times they can just bring the lockbox to closing. Maybe if you've got some shoe covers out there, they can bring that bucket too, but either plan to pick it up or plan to have the buyer agent pick that up for you. Be sure that the seller removes everything. It's a good idea to have a conversation long before, a few days before closing about, hey, seller, just so you can plan for this ahead of time, here's what you need to get out of the house, and here's what you need to leave. And by the way, you can't have a big pile of garbage at the curb because they're going to come pick it up 3 days after closing. You should not leave full garbage and recycling bins full of stuff in the garage. That's not what a buyer wants to see on the final walkthrough. And technically, all that garbage is personal property. It should be gone. So a seller doesn't want to hear that just after they do the final after the buyers do the final walkthrough, and now there's hours to get that done. But if you tell them that a couple weeks ahead of time, they can plan for that. Some last minute tips to give the seller: the garbage recycling bins, the curb, keep up with lawn care, snow removal, call the utility companies to let them know when they're moving, internet, phone, cable, any services like that, they should cancel or transfer, and contact the post office and do a change of address form. Give the sellers the address of the title company, not only the address, but I like to give them a little cheat sheet of, here's when we're closing, here's the address, here's what you should bring, here's when the final walkthrough is going to be. Just as much information as I can. It's pretty simple stuff, but there's a lot that the sellers are dealing with the days leading up to closing. That can be very overwhelming for them. After closing, what do you do for a closing gift, if any? Do you give it to your sellers at closing, after closing in the parking lot? Do you mail it to them a week later? Do you drop something off at the house? So that wouldn't work. That works with buyers if you drop something off at the house, not so well with sellers. So what do you do for a closing gift? Order the yard sign down. Typically, I wait until closing is successful before I order that down. I try to mention it at the closing table that, the sign will come down within a few days. If it's still there in a week, let your agent know and they'll let us know. But don't forget that. Update the MLS listing after the sale. Submit your paperwork in SkySlope. Deliver the commission check and the closing statement to the accounting department. So that can be processed and you'll get paid. And that's it. So we have, that was an hour, 5 minutes. We have 25 minutes if anybody has questions. So lots of time. Otherwise, that's all I got for today.
Thank you, Tim.
Hey, you bet, Jim.
Are you coming out to the title company the lenders out at Fairway for the AI presentation?
Oh, I am not.
Okay.
Are you going to be there, Jim?
Yeah, I wanted to go there, and Dan said this morning that he planned to go too. So
Oh, good.
or
That's
planned
great.
to see me there. So it should be interesting. I need to learn more about that stuff.
We all do.
And thanks
Hey,
for all
Jamie
of your expert advice this morning.
You're welcome, Jim. Jamie Carone, thanks for coming. I know we had a couple others hop off already, but I appreciate you guys coming, and hopefully you got something out of all my rambling today. If you ever
You
have
can always pick up some tips.
Wonderful. And I'm here if you ever have questions. So thank you.
I know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.